I want to start by thanking the organizers for inviting me to this conference because it's been giving me an opportunity to think further about a project that I, in some ways, had wrapped up about 3 or 4 years ago. And I also want to say that I'm presenting here today as violence happens all around us and is, at least to my mind, absolutely overwhelming. So I want to mention the murder of Shireen Abu Akleh by the Israeli military last week, and the hate crime committed by a white supremacist in Buffalo, New York, that took the lives of 10 Black Americans. So that there's that level of systemic violence, including state violence, but there's also the fact that violence between people in their interpersonal relationships is ubiquitous. And so one of the things I'm already taking away from having listened to other presentations is the question of in what ways nonviolence is in fact a response to violence, and how we sort of address this dependence of nonviolence on the notion of violence. I want to show you this image, this tile, which sits on a shelf in my office. And if you look very carefully, you can see that it's broken on the top. And it also, as you will see in a second, became the cover of my book. And I have reflected on it, on its brokenness and its mending, which I did. Someone else broke it and I glued it back together, because it's given me an opportunity to think about trauma and violence and the ways in which our work is invested both in prevention of violence, but also in the mending of brokenness that happens in the process of interpersonal violence. This is, as I said, the cover of my book, published in 2019, and I draw here on this research, but also, as I said, have taken this as an opportunity to think further about some aspects of my research that I didn't fully attend to, and so it's sort of always in progression, and there's always further thinking to do. So this book, which was published in 2019, is based on, in all, 10 years of research, 6 of which were in which I was engaged in ethnographic fieldwork. The book overall takes both textual and ethnographic materials together and weaves them into a reflective narrative about American Muslim, US Muslim efforts against domestic violence. I identify a three-pronged approach in that work, which I call anti-DV work or advocacy work. These are all sort of coterminous in my view. And those 3 prongs are raising awareness of domestic violence in Muslim communities, the existence of domestic violence, but also the dynamics of what constitutes domestic violence. The second one is to provide services to victims and survivors. There is relatively little that addresses perpetrators. That's a conversation to be had. And then the third aspect of this work is providing education and awareness work to mainstream providers of services against domestic violence, including law enforcement, legal professionals, and social service providers. So the book focuses on efforts against domestic violence rather than on the existence of domestic violence in Muslim communities. I'm a religious studies scholar, an Islamic studies scholar, not a social worker, not a criminal justice scholar. And so my interest was in religiously framed efforts in Muslim communities against domestic violence. And I mentioned that it took me 10 years, and I want to sort of emphasize again that this research provides what I think of as a sort of snapshot. So it is in itself historical, and this work is continuously changing, and it is also very difficult to maintain. This is just the table of contents. and I can't stay on this slide, but there is a way in which the book starts thinking about media representations and anti-Muslim hostility as the frames within which Muslim advocates work, then moves on to think about dynamics in Muslim communities, including awareness work, training religious scholars and leaders, providing services, and then moves back sort of out from Muslim communities again to think about how Muslims work in interfaith and mainstream in the movement. And then the last chapter, looking ahead, I will come back to at the end of this talk. So I wanted to explain not only principally how advocates in general talk about domestic violence and domestic abuse, but also how that in particular sort of looks and plays out in Muslim advocacy contexts. So, and we'll start by saying that Muslim advocates, for the most part, the ones that I worked with, use the term domestic violence / domestic abuse. Those are almost coterminous, more so than they use other terms. And they're in principle agreement with the rest of the mainstream anti-domestic violence movement about domestic abuse constituting more than physical violence. So thinking about emotional violence, economic abuse, spiritual abuse, and a range of other issues that go far beyond the application of physical violence to a person. The other important piece here is that the term domestic violence most often refers to violence between spouses in marriage, sometimes includes things like elder abuse or abuse of children. And in the mainstream movement, there has been a move in the past decade or so to sort of specify and move in more closely to what is called intimate partner violence, which also points to the fact that it's not always in marriage and that it's not always between a man and a woman, and zooming out a wider lens of gender-based violence. What these approaches have in common is an understanding of abuse / violence as a power and control dynamic in which one individual exerts control in order to stay in a position of power. So it's a hierarchical relationship. And what often also shows up in the literature is the fact that domestic abuse is often cyclical, so has sort of, and cyclical and also spiraling. And it needs to be said that the end of the spiral not infrequently is a domestic violence, killing, or murder. It is significant to me that Muslim advocates have adopted this mainstream definition, and here is why. One of the reasons why this is important is because these definitions of what constitutes abuse and the notion of gender-based violence in particular come out of feminist frameworks. And as you will see, as I continue, these feminist frameworks are not adopted for the most part by Muslim advocates. And so staying involved in the mainstream definitions and the mainstream movement is important on a number of levels. In the title, I had offered this notion or this term, an ethic of non-abuse, and I want to explain that a little bit here. I introduced that term in the book. It's not one that the advocates themselves use, but I developed it in order to explain what I see as the smallest common denominator of everyone involved in Muslim advocacy work against domestic violence. So it's a non-negotiable foundation. There is no question that everyone involved in the movement is against abuse in all its forms. It's not a sort of like, well, as long as it is not ... It's an ethic of non-abuse. And it was important to me to think of it as an ethic because it, in my view and in my research, emerges through practice. So rather than starting with, say, the Quran or the Sunnah, it starts with what I think of as what I have come to think of, and I'm cautious, I'm not a theologian by training or in the work that I do, but what I've come to think of as fitra. So I asked many of the advocates why they're doing this work, and it turns out that many of them were either witnesses to abuse at one point in their life, or they're victims and survivors themselves. And there is something that holds this together that is an understanding, an innate understanding that I think of as part of fitra, that this is unjust, that it is not an acceptable way to be treated by someone else. And so this notion of an ethic of non-abuse holds together the interdependent relationship between discourse and practice. And one thing that comes up frequently in these conversations is the notion of justice as a counterpoint to domestic violence or domestic abuse being a form of oppression. And so there is a relationship here, and I will come back to the Quran, but I intentionally didn't start with the Quran because that's not where the advocates start their work. We've already seen the notion of jihad appearing several times in a sort of renegotiation of what jihad means in this conference. And so I wanted to offer here one definition that has been very influential for me by Dr. Amina Wadud from her book Inside the Gender Jihad, where she describes the gender jihad in particular as a struggle to establish gender justice in Muslim thought and practice. At its simplest level, gender justice is gender mainstreaming, the inclusion of women in all aspects of Muslim practice, performance, policy construction, and in both political and religious leadership. And this is in the introduction to Inside the Gender Jihad, and the book goes on to talk about what forms that take. And what I want to point out here is that this is it's not a discursive category, it's a practice. The gender jihad is something that people do, not something that people talk about. So here comes another concept. I'm thinking of this as sort of like a building block approach, which is the idea of protective or benevolent patriarchy. And so what I found in my research was that Muslim advocacy efforts against domestic violence were often in a very complicated relationship with feminist ideas. So yes, definition of domestic violence, not so much the understanding that most feminists embrace, and those feminists were very influential for the development of at least the US and North American movement against domestic violence, the understanding or idea that it is patriarchal hierarchies in families that actually create the conditions for abuse. Not all hierarchical relationships are necessarily abusive, but they have the possibility for abuse built into them. And what I learned, I came to this research as a feminist scholar, feminist Muslim scholar, but what I learned is that domestic violence is not necessarily a feminist issue or a feminist cause. And the nature of the efforts that I've been studying, for the most part, I would identify as not connected to feminism. Instead, I see a discourse at work here that I think is a response to feminist critiques of patriarchal power hierarchies, but that basically posits that it's men's responsibility to protect women and children, which in turn rescues patriarchy from a sort of negative critique perspective or position to one in which men are responsible for the patriarchy as a positive ethic. And it is a sort of doubling down on patriarchy as intended by God. And the protective patriarchy framework is utilized in advocacy efforts in a variety of ways. One thing that I want to point out, this is not a sort of sincerity question for me, but I often saw it both as effective and as strategic as a move to meet communities where they're at, rather than antagonizing, alienating them by insisting on a feminist framework. And I want to come to the Quran, because the Quran does show up in these efforts in a variety of ways, and just share with you approaches to two particular verses, which in interesting ways sort of form the basis perhaps of an approach to marital relations that can include violence, and one that is essentially non-violent. So one, and none of this is surprising to most of you, is Quran 434, which establishes qawama, so sort of supports this idea of protective patriarchy. And depending on how it is interpreted, and there are many, many interpretations, it can be read to sanction physical disciplining of wives. Really importantly, none of the people I did my research with supported the interpretation of idribihunna as to actually strike. And there are several ways to sort of go about that. One is to offer alternative translations of what daraba means in this particular context. And the other, more often employed one, is to utilize the sunnah of the Prophet to argue that if the Prophet Muhammad didn't strike his wives, then no other Muslim man is in a position to do so. But the other thing that happens, and Quran 434 is a verse that the advocates definitely struggle with, but it's also often imposed on them, especially by sort of mainstream US media. It comes up more frequently than you would possibly believe. The other thing that they do is emphasize another verse in the Quran over this one, and that one also probably familiar to many of you because it shows up in every Islamic marriage ceremony nikah that I've ever been to, and it is the foundation in advocacy work for the ideal Islamic marriage model, and it is based on tranquility, on sakina. So we see this term, tranquility could also be peacefulness, right? So we see this term both in the title of my book, which I borrow from one of the organizations that I work with, the Peaceful Families Project. And so sakina here represents peaceful living together in marriage with love and mercy between the spouses. And the advocates make the argument that that model, that notion of sakina cannot coexist with any kind of violence and abuse. So you can't have tranquility if there is also abuse and violence happening. Nope, not yet. And lastly, I want to sort of point out that in the concluding chapter of the book, which is not really a conclusion, I started talking about advocates that I started meeting at the very end of my field work, and that I've seen become more active in these spheres, who are often younger. And what's notable about them is that they have made a decision to, instead of focusing on domestic violence exclusively, which is what the efforts since the 1990s for the most part have been, to move to a wider social justice framework that incorporates the notion of gender-based violence as an issue of social justice. And those kinds of efforts take a somewhat different direction. They're not averse to, for example, providing services. The provision of services is a very complicated thing, not only because there's never enough money for it and no one wants to pay for it, but it's also very complicated because it falls sort of like in the arena of how do we help people while also staying critical of the systems and structures that make them victims and survivors, right? And so service efforts are usually not necessarily critical of the wider system that produces this, And so a social justice approach is able to incorporate the issue of domestic violence in particular into wider frameworks. It also risks being too wide and not putting enough focus on the specific issue any longer. What is happening, including in organizations, one of which I'm working with on a project called Hard to Grow, is a move to be survivor-centered, to intentionally focus around the needs of survivors and less so on perpetrators. And the second one, and those are not mutually exclusive, but they're also not necessarily connected with each other, is to recognize that the so-called criminal justice system, so the legal system, is in fact entirely ineffective at addressing gender-based violence and domestic violence. That's because it's racist, because it's hostile to Muslims, but also because it is patriarchal and violent in itself. So the punishments for infractions related to domestic abuse themselves are violent forms of dealing with these transgressions. And so these are approaches, including abolitionist approaches that are for abolition of prison systems and the police. But there are also approaches that focus on changes in Muslim communities, that develop an ethic of social justice, in a system of restorative justice, and an ethic of care. So I will leave you with that, and I'm hoping for a robust conversation because I, as you can probably tell, have many more questions than answers at this point. Thank you.